What's up, gamers? My name is Jay Bell from Panda Game Manufacturing, and today I'm giving you a behind-the-scenes look at a game that is a smash hit. Not only is it toyetic, it really breaks the mold when it comes to offering unique components inside of your game box. This might sound a little monstrous, but I command you to join my ranks as we prepare for battle and go behind the board. Clint Bohaty, thank you so much for joining me today to go behind the board with Necromolds. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you very much, Jay. And I'm excited to be here.
Awesome. So before we actually jump into the production of Necromolds, I kind of noticed something that I wanted to ask you about with the company. So Necromolds is both the name of your game and also the name of your company. And I've seen this happen a few times in the past where this is often an indicator of high success projects where it's you didn't realize it was going to be as cool as it is. So tell me a little bit about the history of the company Necromolds.
Yeah, so as far as the company goes, essentially prior to Necromolds, I had worked on a board game called Hounded that I designed and I did the illustration work for, that's published by Atlas Games. So I had done a board game prior to Necromolds, and Necromolds, the board game, was the first game that I decided this is one that I want to make. And it's one that I not only wanted to design, but I wanted to publish, work with the manufacturer, and then also advertise and promote, post-sales. So the company was built around that idea. So if Necromolds wasn't as cool of a game as at least I think it is, I probably wouldn't have decided to build a company around it. But I felt like it was a project that I wanted to see through the full way. So I've started working on some other games that aren't related to Necromolds, kind of tinkering with some ideas. And it'll be interesting to see if I publish those under my Necromolds business, although they're not necessarily Necromolds games. I haven't had to deal with that consequence yet of linking the company so directly to the Necromolds game. But we've got some cool new Necromolds stuff that we're working on. So the game will only continue to grow as long as people keep playing it and enjoying it.
That sounds like a bit of a great problem to have. You got this thriving thing and you get to decide how you want to add to it or kind of branch out from there.
I always knew when I started working on it that I wanted it to be more than one game. So I always saw it as the potential for essentially a family of games, right? A family of games that are designed for both kids and adults, challenging enough for adults to play and have fun, but also accessible enough that kids can get into it as well with some scaling rule sets. And it doesn't just have to be a war game, but I think a thing that makes a Necromolds game is really the clay and the physicality of the game. And I knew there are more games I wanted to make within that universe. So I decided to name the company after the game because I knew that Necromolds wasn't just going to be one game for me. It was going to be a family of games.
Sure.
As long as it was successful. So if it was not successful, then it would be one very short-lived game, and then I'd start working on something else.
No, I'm happy that you all have success because you've kind of talked about it a little bit already. I myself am not a war gamer, but Necromolds really does bridge the gap, and for me at least as a first time kind of player, where it feels like a war game where there's measuring and there's these units that you need to tactically position, but you're playing with clay, so it's just this weird blending of things that I personally would have never thought about. But I feel like I have the kid version of miniatures that I get to actually make myself.
Essentially, the starting kernel of the idea for Necromolds was influenced by the toys and games that I played growing up. And I think about playing with green army men, right? Or action figures on my bedroom floor and having fake battles between them. And I think the spirit of that play is what I wanted to capture in Necromolds. And wargaming itself, as far as a genre of board games, captures that energy. A lot of war games are a lot crunchier, like Warhammer. So they're a lot more intimidating for people. And I noticed going to conventions that I was seeing more and more families playing Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition or more accessible tabletop RPGs but I wasn't seeing a lot of families and kids playing war games. Not to say that there aren't any, but it just didn't seem like the accessibility was there. So I wanted to design a war game to introduce that genre to new players and to younger players or to adult players who just have never played a war game before. And I think the clay aspect of it and the physicality of that aspect of it is obviously core to the idea and is a ton of fun. But I also think it acts as almost a Trojan horse because people who aren't war gamers see the clay and they don't necessarily know they're playing a war game. They just know they're playing a really fun game. So they want to mold monsters, they want to smash monsters, and then lo and behold, they play a few games and now they're a war gamer. And now they understand, kind of just like you were saying, Jay, the aspects of where do you place your units? How far away are they? Where do you dedicate your forces to one side of the board, or do you kind of sprinkle them out and split them up? All of those strategic decisions that come in a war game happen in Necromolds.
Speaking of strategic decisions, one thing that I often talk about when I'm doing account management in my role at Panda is helping clients understand that they should think about the experience or the value for the experience that their consumers will want to pay for. If their game is more of a party game that's just cards, is that like a $20 experience, or is it a game that's worth a $40, $50, $60 experience? When it came to Necromolds, how did you sort of find that valuation and then allow it to influence your component decisions for manufacturing?
Yeah, that's a great question. Determining the value of the core box set was really tricky because the playfulness and the toy factor of Necromolds, if it was at a Target, would probably price the game at toy pricing for a lot of parents. War games, on the other hand, are on the opposite spectrum. A lot of war games are much more expensive than Necromolds. So if you look at getting into Warhammer or any game that has a lot of plastic miniatures, those games are, $120 plus entry fee just to get into the game. So Necromolds found itself in a kind of in the middle where it has the toy factor of toys and games for kids, but then it's in a genre with a lot more bigger, expensive games. And for me, my goal has always been to get the product pricing and the MSRP closer to the toy aspect. So I'm always trying to, when I'm designing it, get as much cool stuff in the box as possible to enable the player to get the fullest experience possible out of the game. So in the core box, we've got terrain, we've got the fully illustrated battle map. The battle map even has a Where's Waldo, can you find it aspect of it for really young kids. There's the lore book that comes inside the battle box as well. So really trying to cram as much cool stuff in that box as possible without the price creeping up too high. And that's always been a tricky part with Necromolds. Because if you're a parent and you're shopping for a toy for your kid, you're probably looking for something less expensive. Versus most games now, at least I think most core games fall into that $50 to $65 range. And we're kind of right in that right now. It's easier to lower the price later than it is to raise the price later. I don't want to push the game any more expensive than it is, but I also have to look at the realities of the cost of manufacturing, the cost of freight, and just the final landed cost that influence what the final MSRP is. And so knowing that those costs fluctuate, and they usually fluctuate in the upward direction. It's a nice day if you get an email saying that shipping prices have gotten cheaper. Usually that doesn't happen. So you need to have the margin in your pricing to allow for those variables. And it's a lot easier to lower the price later if you can, versus raising the price later and turning away all those customers who always saw your game as X price and now it's Y price.
Yeah, definitely things that other publishers watching this will definitely appreciate you mentioning. You also talked about some of the things that, you try to cram into the box and make it as great of an experience as possible. So let's get into that. Unboxing Necromolds reminded me that there are some options that people might not know about, right? In Necromolds, you actually don't put sort of like the game board on top and then the rules. You utilize a window in your box and kind of adjust that setup. Let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the window was a huge decision. One, because it's not the cheapest, you know, it's not the cheapest feature to include in your box design. It's got to be cut. It's got to have the little plastic, to protect the window and stuff. But for me, having the window is really important to Necromolds because I wanted to really push the toy factor for people. And I also wanted to give them a sneak peek at what makes the game so cool. And so even though Necromolds is just starting with this next printing that's coming up to push more into distribution and to hopefully get into more retail stores, we do have 80 to 100 mom and pop retailers who have supported and have sold Necromolds. And I wanted to make sure that when the game was sitting on a store shelf, somebody could pick it up and see the caster ring through the window, see the spellbook through the window, and know right away through those components what the game's all about. So you look at the back, you see the clay, you see a little preview of what the game looks like in action. On the front, you actually see the physical components that you're going to be interacting with. And I think seeing it just opens up the imagination to what that experience is like. The game, and not to go off on too much of a tangent, but when I was designing the game, the physicality of the components was really core to the game's design. Most of the rules in Necromolds have a physical component that are directly related to them. And part of that was because the game is designed for younger kids to experience and play. And when there's a physical component directly related to a more abstract rule, it's a lot easier to learn for a younger player. But also because I wanted to be able to lay out all of the components for Necromolds and ask someone, how does this game play? And most likely they could get 80% of the way there. And I think by having those components through the window on the cover, you give people a sneak peek at what the rule set's like. They can look at it, they can look at the picture on the back of the box, and they can say like, oh, I know how this is gonna play. This looks like a lot of fun. And that's why the window, I think, is so important to a game like Necromolds.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, if I were to see it in a retail store, it would make me pick it up because it's not something that you commonly see in gaming. And so it would at least get me to like turn the box over and be more interested.
Yeah, and I think that's the goal, right? Is like, there's so many games on store shelves and there's new ones every week and every day. So how do you do that one thing that gets someone to stop and then just turn the box around? Like if you can get them that hook, right? It's like you're fishing. It's like you want them to take a little nibble. And if they can take a little nibble and flip the box around, then hopefully they'll learn something that'll have them walking away with that game and bringing it to their next game night.
Another thing that sort of surprised me in the decision-making process, or like when I was thinking about it and playing the game, I was like, I want to ask Clint, what decision or like what thought process led to the decision that the spellbooks and the caster rings would be fully assembled and fully stickered upon like the customer opening up that box? Because obviously that comes with the cost during assembly, but there's still value to it. So tell me about your thoughts there.
Yeah, so when it came to the spellbooks having the stickers and being fully assembled, I wanted players to be able to fully experience the game as much as they can right out of the box. And part of that decision are the stickers, the pre-assembly, having the stickers already applied to the spellbooks. And then part of that also goes to the product window, right? If we want to show a spellbook in the window, it should probably be fully assembled with stickers on it to give people the full view of what the thing looks like. Because it's a unique game component, no other game has that. I also think part of that was also including clay in the box. Our monster packs include a little thing of spell clay. And part of the decision for including that was that when a kid walks away from the board game store with a monster pack, maybe at home they already have the battle box and they just bought a monster pack from their game store. I want them to be able to open it up in the car, grab a little piece of clay out of the box and mold the monster on their drive home. and because I want it to feel like as much of a toy as possible, and nothing would be a bigger bummer than getting a new toy, opening it in the car, and not being able to use it till you get home. So that's one of the reasons. Also, just giving people extra clay gives them more game time with the core game. But really, the toy factor was the driving part of both the stickers, including clay, having everything pre-assembled, so a kid could open the box and start playing with it right away.
You made a great point there that, you knew what would be best for the audience, and that helped you make the decision about what would be best for the packaging and those choices there.
A lot of the decisions are easier when essentially you're making the thing for yourself. So Necromolds has always been, essentially it was a project that, or it was a board game that I wanted to see real because I wanted to play it and I wanted to own it. And if I only sold 50 copies, as long as I have one of those copies, like that's cool. And now I'll go work on something else. But luckily enough people have also enjoyed the game and see what I see in the game that we've been able to keep working on it and keep adding new stuff to the game and growing the family of games that is Necromolds. But when you're making it for yourself, it makes a lot of those decisions a lot easier.
Yeah, so Clint, talking about the sort of process that you went through with Peter for those different components, I read in the rule book that when you're taking the clay out of your mold, there are these air pockets that are specifically designed to help the mold go well. Tell me about some of that development and this. I don't imagine all of the components, the spellbook, the ring, the finding the right clay, that was just a one-day kind of thing. Tell me about some of the things you went through with Peter to get this right.
Yeah, so I guess I would actually start before I met Peter. So prior to getting in touch with Panda, or I should say Panda getting in touch with me, which was great, was when I knew I wanted to work on Necromolds myself and publish it myself and do a Kickstarter for it. Really early on, I started doing research into factories that could supply clay. I was, going to Alibaba or other websites where you can source. You can talk to manufacturers and source materials from overseas. So I was ordering kind of different test clays and different items and talking with factories to try to figure out what it would take to actually make this thing. And because there's so many different components in Necromolds, it meant talking to a lot of different potential suppliers. And the clay was one of those resources that was not easy to find a supplier for at the quality that I wanted out of the clay. Because clay means, it can be really sticky, it can be really soft. Sometimes they call it mud. There's a ton of different names for, clay and play clay. So supplying it was really challenging. And eventually, Peter and at the time Joe from Panda reached out to me, and they had seen my Necromolds launch video or my announcement trailer, and they thought it was a really cool project. Peter, if you talk to Peter, that he likes toys and collectibles and stuff like that. So he knew right away what I was trying to make out of Necromolds. He got it. One of my hopes when I made that announcement trailer was to hopefully get emails from potential partners to actually make the thing. I wasn't afraid to do the groundwork myself and try to work with the factories overseas and source the whole thing. But I knew there were probably more efficient ways that I just didn't know about yet, being a first-time game publisher. And so the email from Panda was great because they knew what, Panda knew what I was trying to do. They knew how they could work with me to create the game. Obviously, all the paper components are really straightforward for a company that makes board games, like boards and cards and just all the accessories around your standard board game. But also the fact that they can also work with suppliers who I was talking to earlier to try to source the clay and have people there to also quality check the clay and make sure that the clay that we're receiving is the same consistency as the one that we approved during our pre-production process and during our proofs. So having, yeah, so basically working early on with Peter was in Panda was huge, to streamline our manufacturing process and get those materials sourced. So back to your question, one of the specific things you asked about was the air holes that are inside of our spell books. So after the Kickstarter was successful, one of the first steps is to receive essentially like 3D printed or resin printed prototypes of plastics from the factory to review. And I don't remember, upon receiving those and upon doing some of my own home tests with a resin printer that I had picked up to do my own prototyping, just to keep things moving and to be kind of fast on my end, I realized that in our early designs that I designed with a normal PLA 3D printer, is that PLA, because of the manufacturing process, air can escape from it when you're molding something out of it. The air can kind of seep out of the porous plastic itself, or probably through the little tiny microscopic gaps that are between the levels of clay or between the levels of plastic. Resin, on the other hand, is a different printing process and is probably much closer to injection molding. And I realized that if a cavity on our mold got too deep, without an air escape hole there, you just lose those details. And so that was something that I didn't learn until we were in the prototyping process, and we had started the pre-production part of manufacturing. And I realized that to get the full details out of our mold, I should err on the side of caution and add air holes to those deepest pockets, so then the injection molds can breathe as well as the 3D printed parts can breathe.
I understand what you're saying now only because I've been to the factory and I've seen exactly what you're talking about. But yeah, you mentioned a really great point that, one, Panda loves to experiment with new and interesting components. So a project like Necromolds is something that we are super passionate about because it lets us learn new things and bring new things to the game table. And we are more than capable of working with any like sourcing teams that you've kind of already looked at. So oftentimes I get people who want to quote with us and they're like, hey, can you do this component? And I'm like, we haven't done it before, but I'm pretty sure we can. So let me find out and let me get you some different sourcing prices for that. But yeah, Peter is definitely someone who knows all about collectibles and toys, and the perfect project manager for Necromolds.
Well, and I think on that point too, not only like did we source our clay, but we also sourced on our distance tools, we have these little wrist lanyards. And the idea was that I wanted like the deluxe distance tool to feel kind of like a toy as well, and you could wear it on your wrist when you play and have easy access to measure during the game. And the wrist lanyard was something that I had found from a supplier pre-Panda, and I was able just to share that contact info with Peter because it was a component that Panda themselves doesn't make, but it's one that they can source. And so, and one thing with sourcing it through a factory like Panda versus trying to source it myself is that they're much better at negotiating with the factories overseas. So they can negotiate directly with the supplier, and because we're ordering so many at once, get better pricing than if I was probably ordering those same things on my end. So there's just an efficiency with having essentially one point of communication, for me being Peter, who then helps channel that communication out to the different parties within Panda to make the game.
I've never had to ask for lanyards before, but if you would have come to me and said, hey, Jay, do you think we can do lanyards? I would have been like, absolutely. We've done wilder things before. We can definitely find you some lanyards.
Oh, yeah. I mean, you guys, yeah, you've done plushies. So there's a ton of stuff that Panda makes that I haven't had the opportunity to do yet, but it's on my to-do list, my future accessories and things to investigate, card sleeves, plushies. I know there's a lot of cool stuff that you guys have produced that I really want to try making at some point.
I was actually really impressed when I played Necromolds to see one of my favorite components, which is like cardboard constructibles, used in a way that I've never seen before. So the terrain pieces that you have, some of them, I think specifically in the Call to Arms expansion, you can actually like fold them over to give them more depth than just like a standard two-dimensional piece of cardboard. And I was like, why have I never realized this before, that you can do this with cardboard pieces? So that was really cool.
Originally with Necromolds, with the core game, I knew I wanted terrain to be in the box, and having three-dimensional terrain has always kind of been an aspirational goal, but there's just costs involved. So for the core game, we decided, let's just keep the core game at two-dimensional terrain. It still blocks movement, it still blocks line of sight, it still looks cool, and we'll save 3D terrain for another opportunity. And when we got to work on Call to Arms, that was an opportunity to say, okay, we've got this new game we're coming out with. Let's add some 3D terrain inside this box, because we've got the wiggle room within our pricing to get it included. One thing that Panda makes are these little component boxes, essentially include all the resources like cards and little punchboard demo pieces to give someone an idea of the things that Panda can make and the quality of those things. And inside one of those kits was a 3D constructed piece of terrain. It was like a little watchtower. I did some research within your booklet and found that the creator of that piece was a company called Tinker House, who Panda collaborated with on designing that little 3D constructed watchtower. So I ended up reaching out to Tinker House, and they're out of the Seattle area, and basically was like, hey, would you guys want to collaborate on this? I was like, I saw you guys made this 3D piece for Panda for their game components kit. Turned out really cool. I want to do some 3D construction for my expansion. Tinker House specializes in doing punchboard 3D terrain pieces for wargaming. It's kind of like it's one of their things, and they do it really well. And so, yeah, basically I reached out to them and I was like, hey, I'm going to make this, but if you guys want to collaborate on this, that'd be really cool. And so I actually ended up collaborating with Tinker House on those 3D constructible terrain pieces. And my illustrator Thad and I kind of came up with the concept for what we wanted the 3D pieces to kind of look like. We provided illustrations to Tinker House, and then they used their knowledge of designing that 3D constructed terrain and came up with some really cool looking three-dimensional assembled pieces. And like you said, one of those cool things is just having 2 layers of punchboard folded on itself to add a little bit of depth to the piece. And one of the design goals with those 3D pieces was that we didn't want the user to be required to use glue when assembling the terrain. So because Necromolds is a game designed for kids, I still wanted the expansion to be designed for kids as well. And I didn't want to give the player any more assembly steps than they really needed. So we wanted to make really cool looking 3D terrain, but we wanted to do it in a way that's really easy to assemble and doesn't require glue or any other kind of components to make the assembly happen. So that's kind of how that graveyard terrain set came to be. That's included in the Call to Arms box.
I would certainly say mission accomplished. It's some cool 3D terrain. And honestly, when I played it, we had trouble like deciding which ones we were going to put on the board. There were just too many good options. But we definitely went with like the big cathedral with the doors that you can shoot through when you're doing ranged attacks. But I just loved how that opened my eyes as a designer to the different things you can do with punchboard.
Like so much about war games in general is table presence. Like wargaming, wargamers spend so much time painting their models. So it's, part craft, craft, hobby, and board gaming all combined. And table presence is so important to the feeling that you're playing with toys. And I think having three-dimensional terrain helps push the table presence even further in that direction. Although Necromolds already looks super cool just out of the battle box setup, but by adding a few simple to make, but really cool looking 3D terrain pieces like the crypt or the mausoleum or the little graveyard barriers. Just adds so much depth to the play field. And then, lets you kind of try to snipe through some of the holes that are in the mausoleum. So if the doors are open, you could kind of shoot through there. Or if you wanted to go in the mausoleum, you totally could and just like lift the lid off and have your mini stand in there and like shoot outside of it. So I wanted to add like those holes in the terrain. I added specifically because I thought a kid is going to want to do this. Like if I'm an 8-year-old or a 9-year-old and I'm playing, like I'm going to want to camp inside this crypt and like shoot out of its doors. So how do I design this piece to facilitate that type of play?
I mean, it's just making me think about how cool it is that it's a toy, but it also has like these very tactical and very fun things that you can do with it. And you mentioned the kind of terrain and just the importance of the table presence. That actually makes me think about my favorite component from the base and expansion game are the wounds and the artifacts that you get to interact with. I didn't think I could like the game more than I already did. And then I put like the mask onto one of my molds and I was like, okay, now you're even cooler. And every time I hit somebody with a wound, I can just like stab a little axe into their shoulder. Was that always kind of a part of the idea, or how did that idea even come up?
I had an idea written in my notebook during the original development of Necromolds, which was the idea that you could have like some accessories or something like that. It was a very bare bones idea. And it was really related to potentially having like named hero characters or, extra special characters or like, who are you playing as? But again, it was essentially just like a couple doodles inside my ideas notebook from way back in like 2018. So when we were working on the expansion, we knew that we wanted to add more fidelity to combat without overcomplicating the game. It's kind of a really fine balance because we wanted to add a little bit of crunch to Necromolds, but not too much crunch. And then we also wanted to do it in a way that is plug and play. So if an element of the expansion is too complicated for a player, it's easy just to remove that element and the game still stands and the balance is kind of still there. And so while designing the expansion, we knew we wanted to add a wounding type system to the game. We were working on the necrocaster abilities. So it was like, what are the abilities that the player can do, these spells they can cast during the game? And then I went back to my old notebooks and I was flipping through my ideas just for inspiration and to see if there was anything in there. And I came across kind of those doodles of the hero characters holding weapons or armor or whatever. And I realized that this expansion in the mechanics that we're exploring with spells and potentially with wounds is the perfect pairing for adding these little pieces to the game. So we added the artifacts, which augment the dice rolls of those monsters carrying the artifacts. And then we also added the wound markers, which just made for such a cool way to both if you like lose in combat, it's kind of a little prize, even though you lost, is you get to like take a little sword and stab it in your enemy's monster. So there's like a good satisfaction in the physicality of applying the wound, but it also works as a way to track how many wounds your individual monster has. So instead of having to reference a card on the table or asking the other player like, oh, like what's his health currently at or her health currently at, all you have to do is look at the model and you can see it's got 2 swords sticking out of it, and you know that is a weak target and that you should try to take it out while you can. So it was just kind of a perfect pairing of these are the mechanics that we're currently looking at adding to the game, and then, oh, here's this old idea that I had originally that just pairs so well with what we're working on.
Clint, you mentioned how the wound markers and the artifacts really kind of help change the presence of the table presence. And I think we have to talk about the caster rings, which definitely changes the way the game looks as you progress through it. And that's a huge part of board gaming in general, seeing that board state change and knowing that you've interacted with the game and change the complete like state of what it was. Tell me about the caster rings and how that came up as a component that you knew you wanted.
Yeah, so originally when I was first concepting the game, I started the game's concept really started with the minis themselves. Like I knew I wanted to make a war game that was accessible for kids, and I realized really early on that one way to do that and was to have the miniatures made out of clay. So like that was really the core idea that Necromolds grew out of. Early on, the caster rings came into play because obviously if you're making things out of clay, you want to destroy them. And that was part of the original idea too, right? Is like, oh, as a kid, like I love playing with action figures. I love playing with, the Green Army Men, or I had a board game called Grape Escape, which was an early 90s game, which in the, not too long ago, they've actually republished it. But that game had a little like clay figure that was part of it. Okay. And essentially as a kid, you just want to kind of break stuff. I don't know. As a kid, I just wanted to break stuff and destroy stuff as a kid. And knowing that my miniatures in this war game were going to be made out of clay, I instantly knew I wanted to like smash them. I wanted to destroy them. I wanted to cut them in half. And so I knew I wanted to smash the monsters that were defeated. I knew that was going to be a part of the game. Originally, when I was concepting it, the smashing started off as like a wax seal. Because I thought like, oh, if you're going to smash it, like smash it into something. So in my original designs, I was like, okay, what if it was like a wax seal that you'd use to like seal an envelope? So that was the original like early concept. But then it kind of morphed and I was like, well, what if that wax seal was on your finger? Like, what if you wore it like a ring? So the wax seal, became a caster ring that you can now wear. And then you get to physically, smash down with your fist and destroy that enemy's monster. And part of the reason that idea developed was because my background is in filmmaking, and I took a directing actors class when I was in college. And I remember one of the things we talked about in that course was, as an actor, to get into character, it helps if you have some sort of prop that you can associate with being that character. So maybe it's like a hat that the character wears, or maybe it's a pen they wear, or whatever. Having a prop helps you get into character. For Necromolds, I realized that this ring could be the gateway to like let people have fun. It lets them get into the universe. You put this on and now you are a necrocaster. You are a wizard, and you are going to raise up golems, and you are going to destroy your enemy's golems. And by having something that you wear, it gives the player permission to take on that role. So I think there's a bit of a psychological level, I think, to having something that the player physically wears, but then also obviously just the fun of having your own branded caster ring that you smash down when you destroy your enemy's unit. And it lets you take ownership of that action too. You're like, yeah. Not only did I beat you in the dice roll, but like I'm going to insult you by like smashing your monster and leaving my imprint on the board for my victory.
I didn't know that about actors and props, but I see how that translates very well to what happens in Necromolds. That's super cool. Well, Clint, thank you so much for telling me all about Necromolds. I feel like I not only got to talk about a game that makes me feel like a kid and enjoy gaming, I also got to like learn more about clay and how it's used in games, and talk about molds that are made from molds that let you mold monsters. It's like the game even teaches you a little bit about manufacturing and how that injection works. But this has been amazing, and I hope you've had a great time talking about Necromolds as well.
Yeah, I'd love to talk about Necromolds. So yeah, thanks for having me, and hopefully other board game designers who are thinking about manufacturing a game for themselves will take something away.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining me for another episode of Behind the Board. Please like and subscribe to our channel, and if you've enjoyed watching, be sure to check out our other videos. I'll see you next time.